With us on the panel today is Jeff Taylor, Deputy Mayor and Chair of the Central City and River Plan Advisory Group. We've got Henry Crothers, Urban Designer and Director of LandLab, who is helping us to prepare the plan, and Paul Bowman, Team Leader for City Planning and currently Acting City Planning Manager. Just before we get into the presentation, I'll outline the structure of the webinar. The webinar is recorded and we will send you a link with the survey afterwards. We've scheduled an hour and we'll spend about 40 minutes all up presenting to you and spend the balance of the time answering your questions. Today is really just as much about hearing from you as it is about us telling you what we're up to. We can sneak a little bit past 11:30 as well if we need to. We'll try to answer your questions as we go, but we do have the allocated time at the end. So this is, I guess, the first time we are doing a webinar, so we'll just play it by ear and something will work out. The chat section is closed, so we encourage you to use the questions using the Q&A feature below. You can ask questions anonymously as well, but please be nice. If your question doesn't get answered today, we will endeavour to answer them all and send those answers around with the recording and the survey link. Please, just a reminder, don't forget to fill out the survey after the webinar, as this is the main forum for us to collect your feedback. So that's how it's rolling out today. We'll move on to Jeff Taylor to introduce the project.
Thanks, Jen, and morena everyone, and thanks for your attendance today. As key stakeholders, we value your involvement and your views. And as you've heard, this is about refreshing our CCTP, our Central City Transformation Plan, which was developed in 2015. That plan was based on the understanding that without a cohesive strategy and long-term vision, we could never really truly advance the Central City, and it needs to be advanced. The Central City is the heart of Hamilton and the heart of our business centre. It employs nearly 25,000 people. Last year, more than $650 million was spent there, and industries such as healthcare, education, IT and research and development, retail and hospitality are all strong industries driven from the Central City. And if the Central City is healthy, then it's not just businesses that benefit, it's a city's psyche. How we feel about our Central City is important to how we feel as Hamiltonians. I know it is for me, that's true. We want it to be flourishing, it makes us feel good. Quite a lot has changed in the 5 years since the CCTP was put together. As you'd all appreciate, we need to consider, are some of the ideas still appropriate? Has thinking changed? Have new trends emerged? The physical environment has certainly changed in places. Just look at our riverbank. Victoria on the River came out of the CCTP, and that has made quite an impact. I think it's been a bit of a game changer, really. Its incredible views have opened up our eyes to the way Victoria Street could interact with the river. Thanks to the leadership of Momentum Waikato, we're getting a $73 million theatre and boutique hotel in southern Victoria Street. And these two elements, I think, Victoria on the River and the theatre, have made how Victoria Street engages with the river a focal point, much more so than back in 2015. And I think it needs to be a key part of our planning. So what we're wanting to do is update the CCTP, not a big flashy coffee table book. We're not out to waste resources or time on the process. The emphasis is on getting results and action. And with COVID-19, of course, that refresh has taken on even greater significance as businesses try to recover from the disruption of recent months, and we all steel ourselves for what might be ahead. How will COVID-19 affect our Central City? How will the global push for a post-COVID green revolution in areas such as transport affect us? How do we balance the various modes, cars, public transport, cycles, pedestrians, to create brilliant access in the Central City for everyone? The irony is that while COVID-19 poses a crisis for business, it may actually give us, as a city, the opportunity to develop the central city faster than we might have otherwise. The government and this council in support are aware that we need to play a lead role in getting the economy moving again, getting some big projects underway, keeping the flow of money in the economy and creating jobs. As you'll know, we've put up a number of projects involving the central city to the government in our stimulus package, and there's a lot of government money potentially available. This stimulus package has coincided with the refresh of our CCTP, creating a real opportunity. For me personally, there's real excitement in terms of our river plan work, the opportunity to link our new theatre alongside the riverbank through a series of projects, from a cycling pedestrian bridge near the museum, linking up with Memorial Park in Hamilton East, an attractive water link between Hamilton Gardens and the central city, with a new jetty linking to the museum opened up towards the river to welcome visitors. Imagine the new theatre connected to the OTR through high-level boardwalks, opening up great views and hospitality options, and of course then linking with the casino and the hotels in the north. But the CCTP refresh takes a much wider scope, which is great. How can we create better public spaces that encourage activity and vibrancy? How can we attract visitors? How can we get more people living in the central city? How can we connect the central city so it's an enjoyable and efficient place to get around? That's a challenge. How do we make it a better place to work and live? So I will leave it to the next speakers, who are the real experts, to take you through an overview of our plans. And just to reiterate, tell us either today or in coming weeks, what do you like? What don't you like? What are your priorities? Where should we invest? Where would you invest if you had the opportunity to do so? So thank you very much again, and I'll pass over to the next speakers.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Well, Jeff's really covered off what we're doing, why we're doing the refresh today, and just to kind of reiterate a few of his key points. It's pretty standard to review place-based master plans like our CCTP, so it's been 5 years since that's happened. I guess it's also important to emphasise that this is a refresh, not just an update, so we're trying to take a more holistic approach to reviewing the plan. And as Jeff mentioned, this is because we've had a lot of growth in the last 5 years, in particular a steady increase in our central city residential population as far more apartment developments get built. And then we've also had key urban renewal projects like the OTR. The regional theatre is on the table at the moment. And we've also had a change in government, which has shifted the focus onto an overall approach to wellbeing, so looking at cultural, social, economic and environmental wellbeings together. Just to add to the comments around the shovel-ready projects, many of you are aware that Council submitted a solid suite of projects to Crown Infrastructure's partners recently to help stimulate the economy following COVID-19. For the city centre, these shovel-ready projects include the Hamilton Mode Shift program, so working on the 20-minute city concept, which seeks to maximise and coordinate mode shift projects within, across and around the central city area. This program included central city cycle improvements, the Ward Street upgrade, the Transport Centre rejuvenation and Ferrybank pedestrian and cycle bridge. Other projects that were submitted in this package include the Hamilton to Auckland passenger rail startup service and some enhancements, the Waikato Regional Theatre and surrounding public space upgrade, and development of the Pan-Pacific Hub on the West Town Belt. We should be hearing back from central government in the coming weeks, and that will let us know what we've succeeded on. And then hopefully that will no doubt impact what we develop in the central city transformation plan refresh. So all of these changes and projects really emphasise that we need to continue with the transformation of the city centre, and that critical to this is a relevant plan to coordinate and prioritise these projects. In our review of the CCTP so far, we've identified some key overall gaps and opportunities. Primarily, we need a spatial plan to capture what goes where and when, and show the connections and networks and how everything fits together. There's also a significant opportunity to elevate our identity as Kirikiriroa and enable mana whenua to have a prominent, authentic and active presence in our city centre. And there's also some room to make sure our city centre is welcoming to all people, so that it's accessible, it's inclusive, it's child friendly and it's age friendly. Diversity is key to a thriving central city. So as the purpose of today is to share where we're at and get your feedback. Things are draft, and that's because we haven't fully developed everything, and there's a really great opportunity in that for you to provide really genuine, constructive input to how we're shaping this master plan. And so we just want to test with you if we're on the right track. And so just for context as well, this is the first phase of engagement. So we will take your feedback from today and from the survey and incorporate that into the draft plan. Following that, we will come back to you in about July, roughly, to present the full draft master plan for your feedback again. So I'll now pass you over to Henry, who will run you through the vision, principles and key design moves. Oh. That's a reminder of where we are. Right, Henry.
Kia ora everyone and good morning. Henry Crothers from Landlab here. I've been working with Jeff and Paul and Jen and the team over the last few weeks to put together this draft material for discussion. As Jen's mentioned, this is really the starting point for us and the beginning, and represents just where we've got to initially. So we're really keen and open to and interested in your commentary and your feedback. And I think just building on what Jen mentioned before, I think one of the things that we've tried to do is to look at what was in the CCTP plan previously, also look at what was in the river plan, and look to kind of bring some of the initiatives and thinking in those two documents together so that they kind of mesh together, and particularly in terms of how the city and the river overlap and interact. And that's what we've been sort of seeking to do. This slide, I guess, represents what's in the current CCTP document, and its outcomes and its key design strategies. And as Jen mentioned, we see some opportunities in terms of this refresh to expand on that a little bit more, which is, I think, is the next slide. And so what we've been doing is sort of looking at some of the vision and the aspiration in each of those documents and trying to find, I guess, what is common in those two deliverables, but also what we think is the kind of Hamilton city that we're looking to create in the future. And so in the first instance, we've pulled together a bunch of design principles, and these really focus on what kind of place, what kind of city centre do we want. And so the first one is obviously is about people, and all these projects are about people, and really that comes down to a public realm that supports the function, the livability, the vibrancy, and the kind of connectivity of and experiences of the city centre. And so all these projects are for people, and that's really a starting point for us. The second one is about livability, and I think there's some really great opportunities in the future for people to be living in the city centre, and for the city centre to have a far greater mix of uses and activities. It is an environment that is currently a bit challenged by its scale. It's a really large city centre, and being 140 or so hectares, but it does provide the opportunity for people to be able to live, work, and recreate, and all in one place, and potentially without needing a car. Vibrancy, and that's really about focusing on the public realm, so that public realm really supports the activation and the visitation and the experience of the city centre as an appealing proposition for locals and for visitors, that it supports and the economic vitality and prosperity of the city centre. And we know from other projects in other places that having people out and about and walking in footfall and spending money is the key driver for how we create a successful town centre. Memorable, and this is where we start folding in all the things that are unique and special about Hamilton and the Waikato, you know, the unique cultural history, the river, the morphology of the town centre, the parks and the open spaces, and the natural environment, and the kind of things that will make people remember coming to Hamilton. The fifth one is connected. That's really about how people get to and around the city centre. Obviously, we want there to be more of a focus on walking and cycling, micro-mobility and public transport. There's a lot of space in the city centre at the moment that's dedicated to cars and to parking. And again, we know that we need to get a better balance between all of those different modes in the future. The sixth one is about design-led, and I guess this is about being bold and aspirational and courageous, and this applies to the governance within the city. It applies to the design projects and the thinking around these types of strategies. And then once you get to delivering and designing specific projects, it's about seeking design excellence and establishing really good processes and communication and strategies to enable us to achieve success. The seventh one is sustainability. It's a pretty common term, I guess, that everyone's familiar with. I think this is about applying it to your place. There's a tradition, I guess, of gardening and agriculture and an environment that incorporates a river and some, a gully system and some great open spaces. And it's about understanding and responding and respecting that. But it's also about looking at how we integrate green infrastructure and sustainability and innovation into future projects and future spaces in the public realm of the city centre. And then last one is about compact. The idea that we want, rather than Hamilton continuing to sprawl out, we want people to be able to live and to work and to play in the city centre, and that we can provide an environment that is appealing and supportive of that, and that in turn contributes to its success as a place, as an experience, and financially and commercially as well. So a lot of those are probably pretty familiar kind of aspirations and apply, I guess, just generally to making good cities and good towns. And so we might then, Jen, move on to the key moves, which is the sort of next exercise for us, which is to look at how can we establish a series of kind of diagrams or ideas that, again, bring together some of the previous thinking and establish a really clear vision for the town centre. And I think what we hope is that these ideas sort of resonate and that they have some longevity and that they can last for a while, so that you can work towards achieving the vision and achieving the projects and delivering the projects that will lead to achieving that vision. And so these are draft, and these are our initial thinking about how we have these kind of high level aspirations that we can start to work towards. So I'm just going to run through each one, and the starting point really for us was the precincts, and these are actually the same precincts that are in the existing city transformation plan, and we haven't looked to change those. We think we do need to build upon the idea in that, which is to take this large and quite sprawly town centre and start to think about how it can have different experiences and the creation of different precincts and identities within that. And probably in terms of the work that we're thinking about at the moment, we're really talking about the yellow piece in terms of the city centre, the pink in the south end and the riverfront as a sort of focal point of where we're looking to prioritise our thinking and potentially kind of future projects and investment. So that's a pretty simple kind of starting point. And the next slide, probably, Jen. So the first, I guess, idea that we've been exploring is this idea of being able to circumnavigate the city centre with a continuous sort of walking and cycling connection and a sort of public open space network. And to a certain extent, this exists through existing pathways and streets, and open spaces, but isn't really kind of conceived in that way. And so this idea that we can pull all of those things together as a sort of single idea, as a loop in a circuit. It's about an 8-kilometre circuit around the city centre, and that starts to incorporate some of those existing and potentially future open spaces and experiences. And this becomes something that you know exists and that you can experience either in full or in part. As a worker in the city centre, it can become an exercise loop, or if you're a resident, it becomes a similar thing. It becomes something that you can sort of dip into and experience a section or a transect of, but not necessarily the whole loop. But it starts to set up an aspiration for movement and access and public open space around the entire perimeter of the city centre. And it starts also to think about how you arrive and how you experience that. So thinking about from the west, how you kind of transition through the West Town Belt and into the city centre. The importance coming in from the east of those bridges and the experience of crossing the river and arriving, and the future potential for additional connections and bridges that would further support some of those ideas. Next one, Jen. This one's really sort of then diving into the focus on the middle, and I think it's quite commonly thought of that if you make a great city centre, you'll go a long way to creating a great city centre more generally. And so this opportunity that you have within the existing heart of the town to connect a sequence of spaces from Civic Square, Garden Place, Victoria Street, Victoria on the river, and out to the riverfront, I think is really important and a great opportunity to do that in a way that presents a really cohesive and complementary sequence of spaces that each have their own defined function and purpose and ability to kind of host and accommodate events and activities and support placemaking and activation becomes really important in terms of really understanding how that sequence works, and then the kind of curation and interaction with some of the key destinations like the library and the council building and your new theatre and the museum become really important in terms of the overall contribution to this vibrant civic heart. And the idea that this is really the core of the city centre that should be very much focused on people and pedestrians and walking and I think working towards stitching together the activities that are happening on the ground floor and the ground plane of the buildings to make sure that there's a really complementary relationship between what's happening in the public realm and what's happening in the built form. Next one, Jen. The next idea really is about how the river and the city are interacting, and I think it is a really interesting and very three-dimensional way in which the city and the river come together, and it's both vertical and horizontal. So this idea is really understanding that we're talking about pulling the city into pulling the river into the city and letting the city push out into the river, and that happens with this sort of wavy line that represents the buildings and the spaces, the streets, and the bridges and the structures that together create this really rich and sort of layered interface between the river and the city. And I guess it presents a number of challenges from a design point of view in terms of topography and access and how we design and deliver on those spaces, but it also presents a really interesting opportunity for something that is definitely unique and different to other towns and other places in New Zealand. So this is really about celebrating that connection between city and river, and acknowledging that it's more than just the provision of a continuous promenade along the river edge, that there's a range of other experiences that need to be considered in this, and some work to do to promote buildings and activities that sort of turn around and address and orientate themselves towards the river, which obviously is starting to happen with some recent projects and planned projects along that edge. Next slide, Jen. Connected city, I mean, this is really about thinking about how people get themselves to the city centre, and once they're there, how they start to move around. It's really starting to think about providing in future more of a priority on walking, cycling and active mobility and public transport. Hopefully we're starting to work towards a future where there's perhaps less priority on the car, particularly in the city centre, and starting to think about maybe a future for Hamilton where people are driving to the city centre and not necessarily right through the city centre. So this diagram is really just picking up the key walking and cycling connections along the river and around the town centre, the key access points in and out, and the opportunities perhaps within those existing bridges and new bridges to better balance space for different modes. It's starting to identify the kind of potential hierarchy of streets between Victoria, Anglesey and Tristram. Also some of the important sort of town centre streets like Alexandria Street that could have a different role and function. And I think really significantly it identifies the future or potential for a future city centre train station, which would plug you into a much broader context and is really appealing proposition for both residents and visitors as a way of getting in and out of the city centre. Next one. And so the next few slides start to look at that kind of street network and focus in a little bit more on what's the kind of relationship between those key streets and what's the identity and role of those in the future. And I think obviously this idea of Victoria Street, which is historically the main street that's closest to the river, it has really great built form and activities along it, that this starts to become the idea of this kind of garden boulevard that is all about people. It's about occupation and sort of activation of that street that is most closely connected to both the city centre and the river. And so the idea that we can in future work towards slowing that down more, rationalising the presence of parking and cars within that street, start to think about how it can function better for pedestrians and cyclists, and how it then connects into the key places and spaces within the city centre, but also how it can connect out and support movements from the city towards the river. And I think you can see here that there's the idea that other spaces such as Garden Place and open spaces on the river's edge start to kind of interact and overlap with this idea of this garden boulevard and this kind of green focus. Next one is really that the collection of those kind of north-south streets. And so we've talked about Victoria Street as being the kind of slow speed, people focused street that's closest to the river. And perhaps what starts to happen as we move away from the water is a sort of a gradation of speed and typology in the street. So we've got slow and most people focused closest to the river. We've got the red of Anglesey Street as a PT focused street, and the blue of Tristram as being a little more focused on the movement sort of through and past the city centre and its relationship with the West Town belt. And I think there's an opportunity, and we need to do some more work and to understand this better about how Anglesey Street can become a focus of public transport. That we can look at some other things about how we distribute bus stops and other modes along that street, so that it is really a clear priority as a PT route, and works a little better in terms of perhaps some of the connections and interfaces with the bus interchange. Tristram Street, I think, has got some challenges in terms of how we kind of manage that. I mean, we need that to be the key way to move kind of sort of along and through and past the city centre, but we also need to think a little bit about how it can better stitch into the adjacent city centre neighbourhoods and the public open spaces, and how we can get the right kind of development and edges and activity along that, particularly that edge of the West Town belt. Next one is about the east-west streets, and I think there's an opportunity here to think of all of the east-west streets in a way as a family of streets that are about connecting right across the town from the West Town Belt to the river. And whilst not all of them sort of open out visually to the river, there are opportunities for connectivity across the town. And obviously at the sort of north and south ends, you've got Mill Street and Anzac that provide these kind of key kind of access points in and out of the city centre, and could become these kind of brackets to the existing city grid. But then all the other east-west streets could become this idea of this kind of family of streets where there's a little more priority on people, where we can design some streets that take advantage of some of the north-facing edges and frontages that each of those streets have. That potentially there's the opportunity for integrating green infrastructure into those streets and supporting that idea of the connection between the two green edges of the city centre. And then the quality and characters of those streets also complement this idea in the centre of this diagram of this kind of public realm connection from the civic square through to the river. Next slide, Jean. The next one really about the sort of lanes and fine-grained space network, and this was something that was identified in the earlier version of the city transformation plan, that there is it's really important that the street has those kind of that the city has these sort of tertiary kind of spaces that provide different experiences and different opportunities than the larger scale public realm network and the streets. And often these are the little moments and little experiences where you really discover things and can be immersed in an environment that offers something a little bit different. And so whilst there are some of these spaces that are currently sort of functional and successful in Hamilton, there probably currently aren't enough to have that sort of permeability and the options and the choices for how you kind of choose to move through the city centre. So thinking about how we can develop up this network, some of which can be delivered through council initiatives, but many which will need to come through kind of cooperation and coordination with the private sector to get a greater range of experiences and porosity and kind of movement opportunities within the town centre, which are really important for having people walking around and moving through the town centre on foot. And then lastly, this kind of leads into our last strategy, which is really about the built form. Thanks, Jen. And probably here's where we need to do a little more thinking. And this is really a strategy that's not meant to make it more complicated in terms of your existing planning rules, but to think a little bit about just what is the aspiration in terms of what type of built form and kind of activity do we want to have in different parts of the city centre. So it's not to say that it's not trying to change your existing development controls, but that there is an aspiration in terms of the blue zone along the river edge to have that sort of more mid-rise scale that is integrated and sensitive to the character of Victoria Street, that provides the permeability and the porosity between Victoria Street and the river, and tries to preserve and enable that sort of smaller footprint, smaller scale, finer grain type development, which represents the kind of existing character of that, and starts to enable and support that idea of the weaving, or that woven edge between the river and the city. The red one is really, more about acknowledging that, that we can have built form that steps up and scale away from the river. And so within that red zone, obviously you're allowed to build, much taller buildings. But I think in that red zone, we're talking about ideally wanting to have, really strong built form that is built strongly to street edges and corners. It has a scale and density about it that supports that mix of uses and that mixed use town centre, but it's still probably about creating a kind of a mid-rise city centre that has that scale that is still human and still enables that sort of sense of connection between what's happening in the buildings and what's happening on the street. But it's also acknowledging that that is the kind of, that's the sort of the centre or the heart of the city. And then the green is really about thinking a little bit about the blocks that start to front towards the West Town Belt, and what sort of uses and activities we have here, and the idea that maybe this is again stepping down from red being the tallest. Green is not as perhaps slow as the blue, but somewhere in the middle. And again, is starting to think about how in the future do some of these large blocks start to accommodate a greater mix of uses and activities. Commercial is starting to happen in some areas. We've got education in there. It would be good to think that there's some sort of medium density residential and other activities happening in that zone. And so it's not about developing rules, it's about having a clear kind of aspiration for the types of things that we want to have happening in each of those precincts. And then obviously this diagram starting to think a little bit about where are they really important kind of landmark corners and frontages that we need to think carefully about in the future. And I think that's certainly the last of our key moves. I think so the intention with these is that as I mentioned earlier on, that these become the principles that we go back to and test and can kind of determine whether or not a project, whether it's a public realm project or a built project, is kind of supporting and aligned with these ideas. And I think the next exercise for us is to move into more detail around how we think about the kind of design strategies that are more specific to movement and open space and streetscapes and public realm, and how we turn those into the kind of design strategies that give you guys the roadmap to go from where you are now to delivering projects on the ground that deliver on the vision that is captured in these kind of high level design ideas. I think that's me.
Great. Thanks, Henry. Yeah, that was, hopefully everyone found that informative and actually hopefully everyone found it exciting. Hopefully everyone's kind of going, yep, we're starting to head on the right track. A little bit of work still to do, but it's sounding promising. So hopefully you're all in that headspace. So we've just still got some questions that are coming through. We've got at least 20 more minutes to go. So if you've got some other big ticket questions you want to ask, please do. Remember, you can ask them anonymously as well, just if that helps. So we've got a question here from Maureen P. Why the max at 10 levels? What about developing high-rise apartments to maximise the views? Paul, are you able to, and Henry, if you feel like it,
yeah,
chip in on this one, please?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the 10 levels, absolutely right. You can go higher. So certainly there's no real height cap on the central city right now. So consents can go in higher. You still need to apply for consent, but if it's the right design and the appropriate location, then 10 levels might be appropriate. Certainly we're trying to have a more sympathetic edge when you come to the riverfront and the public space on the river, and the same when you get to the other side, the west side and the West Town Belt. But certainly in that red area, the thinking is that's what we're seeking, precisely that. We want to intensify, we want to go high if it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I might just add to that. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, I mean, we're not trying to kind of complicate or get too involved in kind of your existing rules. I think it's really about having a really clear aspiration about just what type of built form and what type of kind of responses you're looking for in different parts of the city. And I guess quite often that the rules in the district plan, are kind of rules, and they're not necessarily reflective of kind of aspiration. So it's not here to suggest that if someone came up with a 12-story building, Paul would say no. It's just saying we want to think about the fact that there are differences in what we're trying to do. And in a way, this comes back to that kind of earlier precincts diagram a little bit, that we're trying to create different activities and different responses in different parts of the city centre.
Great. Oh, Sorry. And then we've got a question from Chad Hooker. What thought is there to connect our major event venues to the city centre? So our city streets essentially have a huge role to play in this. In Hamilton, we do tend to have quite wide streets, which can be a constraint, but is also a huge opportunity to do measures like widening footpaths and making them more enjoyable and more kind of logical to follow, so people can kind of self-navigate from the city centre to other destinations around the city centre, like the West Town Belt and the stadiums and the river edge. So a big part of this this master plan is trying to look at that street public realm and recreate it so it is legible and it is logical, and it really helps to reinforce what's important in our city. And yeah, I mean, Henry and Paul, do you have anything to kind of add to that? What other thoughts how we can connect to our major event venues in the city centre? There's also Claudelands across the bridge.
Yeah, I think for some time there's always been that concept of how we encourage that movement from our key stadium facilities, Seddon Park, and the Claudelands Event Centre. So how we best encourage people to walk on foot or by bike or other means, not just by the vehicle, but also if that's appropriate. But just that sense of arrival, and it's something I think Brian's picked up as well, is how do you navigate from one edge of the city to the other, and rather than it being this big amorphous big block pattern, how you work through to get from one side to the other. And I think with the proposed theatre, that's even more important, moving from one location to the other. So certainly, as you said, Jen, how those streets are designed, work and function is going to be quite critical.
Yeah, sorry, if I could just, it's Jeff Taylor, if I could just pop in there as well. Look, I agree, and for some time, as you say, we've wanted to link the city better with Claudelands Event Centre, and I would like to see, because if you've got that kind of west to east move across the central city, down Ward Street and possibly Civic Square, Garden Place, and onto Claudelands Bridge, and I would really like to see a more explicit link, cycle pedestrian link between the central city and Claudelands Event Centre.
Great. So next up, we've got a question from Natasha Ryan. If we want the density and intensity of experience, is the central city a bit too big? Henry and Paul, I have a feeling you'll be positioned to answer this one, sorry.
Who wants to go first?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly currently it is probably, what you'd say is kind of too big, but I think, the opportunity in the future to intensify means that, you can start to think about it being kind of divided up into a series of different precincts and neighbourhoods in a way with different functions. And I think that's sort of what that precinct diagram is trying to do. And there's plenty of room, I guess, in that existing city grid, and that's probably really is the great opportunity that you have to start to intensify the city centre with different uses and activities, and getting people living in the city centre so they're out walking and around and using the streets and the open spaces. All these things start to kind of build on each other in terms of creating vibrancy and activity and footfall and experience, and then bars and restaurants and other businesses that start to work and thrive because there's more people there, and people come and visit and have a really great time and want to come back. And so all those things, we kind of know in successful places all start to kind of work together and build on each other in terms of that experience. And so, that idea is not going to happen that quickly. It's more about kind of sort of organic growth and change over time.
Yeah, I think I basically agree with what Henry said there. I mean, Hamilton's in some respects fortunate because there are lots of opportunities, but it's a big area. It's a big space. It's 120 plus hectares, bigger than Christchurch Central City, and for many years we've been trying to perhaps just break it down so it's more manageable into precincts, and the blue precincts to the north and south are where we've said, well, we want to focus residential, apartments, intensification, townhouses, still providing for commercial, of course, but that's where the predominant focus for residential, whereas that kind of red space and the yellow space in the plan is the more commercial. So just to try and get it into a more manageable context. Otherwise, you tend to get sprawl throughout the city, and there's no real unique part to any one part of the city, whether that's Victoria Street or Ward Street, which is our entertainment district, or obviously that riverfront. So I think, yeah, it's whether that's the right approach still, or whether you just have this big amorphous blob and one precinct to cover the whole area. I think that's something that we're looking for feedback on.
Okay, and so the next question we've got is from Brian Square. Successful central cities tend to have a sense of arrival. The Western Edge Gateway, as noted on the Greenbelt plan, tends to not relate to primary movement into the centre. Question, how does one know they have arrived at the central city? What landmarks, or how intuitive is it? Great question, Brian. So just to, I guess, defend quickly what we've shown here on the green loop is that this is not complete, and we do realise that there's some other gateways, particularly well, actually we have highlighted the bridges as well, so they're some of the key kind of eastern gateways we've got into our central city, but we do need to do a bit of work around the north-south gateways as well. But how does one know they've arrived in the central city? Well, I mean, there's a number of things that are at play here. Certainly a sense of scale really contributes to moving from one environment into another. So that's something that, we need to work through with the built form. And also having some key landmark buildings can always help, particularly ones with really strong corner treatment design. We don't want to be a city where we've got a sign that we've got to go past to know that we're now in the central city. We definitely want to avoid that. So it's doing it through quite sophisticated and holistic interventions that we can start to create those landmarks and help give that sense of arrival to people moving into the city centre.
I might just add to that, because I think one of the other things is the sort of that reinforces that, I think, is speed and traffic and kind of behaviour. And I think one of the things that I think whilst there's an existing 30k zone within the city centre, perhaps we need to look at expanding that further. And so, that's one of the things that, as Jen says, you don't have to drive past a sign, but what you realise is things slow down and everything gets a bit stickier, and there's more people around, and there's a change in character. And so I think, thinking about how we do that on some of those key streets and sort of arrival points, I think is really important. And then I think perhaps the 30k zone, perhaps within that, could start to work towards having an even slower, the city heart zone, where it is even more about people and less about vehicles.
Great. Okay. We've got a question from Mike Neal here saying council needs to commit to a number of defined projects in order to get buy-in and commitment from the private sector to develop. What would be the 3 key projects council would need to commit to make this happen? Well, Mike, I reckon we need to hear from you guys first. So don't mean to deflect the answer, but I guess really that's the whole point of this engagement process, is that we really want to get your take on what you guys all think are your key priorities. Like, we've got some hunches around what they should be. But yeah, I'm just going to put that question back to you come survey time to let us know what your ones are. So we've got a really good collective starting point. Right.
Jen, sorry, it's Jeff here. Could I just add to that?
Sure, Jeff.
Yeah. Mike, thanks for the question, and Jen, I agree. What we are trying to get is a sense from our key stakeholders, such as yourself, about how you see the priorities. What would you invest in? I have made it pretty clear, I think, today and recently that I have considerable excitement about the river-facing projects. The link of particularly linking the theatre to Victoria on the river, that sort of area. You know, that whole strategic area from the hotels south to the museum, I see as very key. And the other thing I would say is what could come out of this in terms of in practical terms when we get to our long-term plan is prioritising a couple of things, maybe two or three key things, and getting those, you know, really pursuing those and designing those, and getting buy-in with the commercial sector on those. So, you know, we will certainly narrow down, but we're really keen to hear what you guys see as the priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. So next question, another one from Graham D, who has to be our top question asker during this engagement session. Thank you, Graham. What other district plan rules outside the CBD need to change to encourage these outcomes occurring? I'll let Paul answer this one.
Thanks, Jen. Look, I don't want to spend too much time on the district plan because I think, as Henry hinted, this is a very forward-thinking document, and we want it to almost inform what we need to do to the plan to make this happen. That's my view. So we don't want to be constrained by current plan settings. But just very quickly, there are a number of things that government are looking at councils to do, given requirements for more housing and infill. So certainly we want to make sure it's as easy as possible to do infill in the central city. There's some things we've already done in the past, such as remove minimum parking requirements. It's not to say people don't have to provide it, but it's voluntary on the developer. So in the past, that was always something, certainly underground parking, that was hindering development in the central city because of costs. Things like building heights, we don't want them to be too restrictive, and height to boundaries in the central city. But I think in the bigger picture, when you look at the city, we want to make it quite clear where we want to see those intensification areas and infill, because the central city needs people. It needs people to live in close proximity and walkability to the city for it to survive in the future, and it needs to be accessible as well. So that wider discussion around intensification in the city is something we need to look at hand in hand with this work. But we don't want to be constrained by the current settings and the rules in the district plan as it exists now.
Cool. Okay, thanks, Paul. We've got some questions here that we might not find so easy to cover off today, but Reese Harvey, so per your opening statement, the Hamilton CBD has a brand issue. What are the key levers / initiatives HCC are considering as part of this plan to attract businesses and residential dwellers into the city to bring these planned precincts to life? Henry and Paul, have you got some thoughts on that?
I mean, I'm happy to jump in a bit here. I mean, I think one of the things we've been talking about a little bit is the importance of kind of curation and placemaking and activation. And I think you know, you can't just sort of hope that we can't talk about this vibrant heart and this amazing river edge and then just build a couple of projects and cross our fingers and hope that it will work. We need to, you know, there needs to be cooperation between public and private sectors, and we need to think about some strategies around placemaking and activation. I think to support some of these projects and to support the investment in, you know, the capital investment in some of these spaces, so that the city is offering you know, events and activities that are about attracting people and visitors to the town centre, that gets people out walking and around in the city centre and experiencing it and spending some money. And you know, as I mentioned before, I mean, I think, you know, the sorts of success tends to bring success, and you make a good project and a good precinct and you get a few people, then, you know, the whole equation sort of starts working working for everyone. So it definitely needs you know, some thinking. And I think the earlier document for the city transformation plan, you know, did start to identify the need for, you know, attracting the right kind of tenants and businesses and things into the city centre. But I think, you know, one of the challenges that I think that the city has, which we've touched on, is that I think you've got quite a lot of those things happening. It's just in this kind of enormous grid that you've got. Those things are happening, but there's quite a long way away. Well, there's quite, you know, long distances between some of the activities and destinations at the moment. And I think, you know, again, the kind of curation of where and how some activities happen, it's going to become important in the future. I mean, I'm not sure about the branding thing. I think I'd say it has you may have a more of an identity issue than a branding issue, in that I don't think you necessarily need jazzy graphics and logos to kind of communicate to people what you're all about. I think you just got to kind of get it actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with all that. And certainly I know the CCTP did have a business attraction project. I mean, look, council, you know, we have a comms team, and I think certainly the Hamilton Central Business Association are the experts in this place. I mean, they deal with our business holders, and they know what's needed for the business community. And I think council need to work even more closely with organisations such as that to ensure that we come out of this recovery well. And I think the levers we can pull are making sure that our council investments and interventions work towards that bigger picture. And that's part of what this project's about. So we're not just doing ad hoc projects all over the city that aren't connected. We need to see that bigger vision and what we want to achieve, and make sure that when you leave the stadium facility, hopefully when they're open in the near future, you do go into the city. And if we're encouraging infill, it's not just about dwellings, it's also having those amenities close at hand for future occupants in the CBD. So they've got an experience as part of their neighborhood, if you can call it that. So I think that's something we have to be very clear on. We're encouraging housing and business, but we want to create that environment that attracts people there, perhaps over other locations in the city.
Thanks, it's Jeff here. Reece, thanks for the question. One key element is certainly connectivity to the river for me. Everywhere I go, or most of us go, people are drawn to water. This is our waterfront, if you like. And I think one of the key elements is engaging with it. Basically, making that a real commitment, not an ad hoc, half-hearted thing, but a real commitment that everybody knows about. And that's one key element for me. Thank you.
Cool. Okay, so I think we'll just have one final question. Again, just bearing in mind that we will seek to answer the rest of your questions. So if you want to throw your last questions in now, then you're most welcome to. We'll get to answering them and send them out with the webinar link and the survey link that will follow this webinar today. So I think we'll just end this with a question from Jeremy Mail, who asks, oh sorry, it's moving on me. How will engagement with the arts and culture sector be facilitated? Oh sorry, I'm having a few problems with questions, sorry. How will engagement with the arts and culture sector be facilitated in terms of some of the ongoing activation and vibrancy of the existing potential within these places? Or is that beyond the scope of this plan? I don't think, no, placemaking is 100% a critical factor of this plan, and we are trying to give a lot of attention to that. This plan is very much focused on trying to deliver actionable matters as well. So I think what you're talking about here will absolutely be included in the scope of this project. Paul, Henry, have you got anything to add to Jeremy's question?
No, I'd agree. I mean, I think we have to engage heavily with that sector, because how these spaces are used by the arts and community is vital to how we learn how these places need to be developed or what happens on the edges of them. So I think it's part of the engagement as this project progresses. I mean, in deliverables, I think, as we've said and heard, we want this to have a clear action for some key projects that we just want to get going on, because I think one of the criticisms of the last CCTP was it was a large shopping list, and we have to be realistic about what can happen, certainly in the short term for this plan. So I think, you know, any feedback that really helps us focus on those key project areas would be great.
Yeah, and I would just agree with that. And I think really what we are probably more focused on in this is this piece of work is to identify those opportunities to engage with that sector and where those might happen, but probably not to dive into the detail of them. But I think what we need and what the city needs is that really clear strategy. And you know, I think sometimes there can be a tendency to kind of bounce around a little bit from sort of project to project. And I think what we're trying to do is put that framework in place, make sure that exists and has the buy-in from everyone that's required to kind of get there. And we can identify all those opportunities where they exist. And then hopefully when those things come up later on, everyone's already bought into the vision and the strategy and the pathway. And then those types of engagement should become easier on a sort of project by project basis, because it's all been agreed and supported by everyone before we get there.
Cool. Okay, well, I think that's probably a good note to round off on. Thank you all very much for taking part in, oh, going the wrong way, sorry. We'll just jump to the beginning again. Right, there we go. Yeah, thank you everyone for taking time out of your busy days to listen in to the webinar. Like I said in the beginning, we will be sending out an email following this to you all, which includes the recorded webinar, the link to the survey, and answers to the questions that we weren't able to answer today. We really, really appreciate the questions that you've been asking. They're all incredibly relevant. Some of the things we don't have answers for straight away, so but they're still really valuable questions, and we'll endeavour to, you know, incorporate the answers into the document as well. So Jeff, do you want to maybe finish off or round up before we press stop share and leave meeting?
Sorry, yes, I was just unmuting myself. Yeah, look, thanks, Jen. I want to reiterate, thank you everyone for participating, and the ball's in your court. We want to hear what your thoughts are. We want to hear priorities. I think the message has come through pretty clearly from us that we will focus on key priorities. It won't be a scattergun approach. As Henry says, we try to create a framework, but a framework so that there will be consistency in terms of, you know, projects that are done in future. In the short term, it'll really be a couple of key priorities that we get on with. And so I'm really interested to hear what your key priorities are. Thanks again for being involved.